Hey everybody, how are you today? So, this is the lecture over the beginning of chapter 6, and I'm going to be talking about immigration as people came to America. I'm going to talk a little bit about urbanization. So, as cities got bigger, what were some of the problems related to urbanization? I'm also going to be talking a little bit about the continued racist policies that existed in America in the North and South during this time. And so you should be watching, taking notes, and then you'll be completing the exit slip when we're done. Make sure you let me know if there's anything that you don't understand. And I'll also put some video clips up as well with the exit slip. Those are optional if you want to watch those and get some additional information. And hopefully you'll get this done by Monday the 9th if you're in Group A, and the 10th if you're in Group B or a remote learner. And you'll be finishing up those reflection questions about the factory simulation and starting to work on your Gilded Age dinner party project. Don't wait till the end to get that one done. It's not due till the end of next week, but I'll be putting out your review questions next week, wrapping up the chapter, and then moving towards our test. So as far as immigration, we kind of started off the chapter with immigration as well, because you watched the crash course video about it, so you already have some background information about this. And it's a topic that I'm sure you've studied for years and years. So you've got an emigrant, okay, that starts with an E. It's someone who's exiting their country. When they're coming to a country, they are an immigrant. Now, we see two real different waves of immigration in American history, and so we need to discuss why they came to America and then what was their life like when they got here. First wave of immigration was considered old immigration, or the original wave of immigration. They tend to call these people the old immigrants. They came, for the most part, between 1880, or I should say 1800 and 1880. Usually they were Protestant in terms of their religious beliefs, so they're not Catholic, but they're Christian, and they came from northwestern portions of Europe, so England, France, Germany, anything like that. Belgium could go in there, things of that nature. And really and truly, they came to America for a better life, for job opportunities, to escape political problems in their home country. So that was pretty much the big situation there. What we see between 1880 and 1910 is a new wave of immigration. And so in this wave of immigration, these new immigrants who are coming during this 20-year period of time, they're pretty much coming to America to, get wealthy, or at least to get paid better than they do in their home country. They, have heard about the American dream. They've heard about people like, Andrew Carnegie. They're hoping to make a name for themselves, to make money, to have religious freedom, to have political freedom, to have economic opportunities. They've heard the stories of how anything is possible. And at this point, we see people who are various religions. They could be Protestant, so Christians who are not Catholics, but for the most part, we see a lot more Catholics. We see Eastern Orthodox Christian. We see Jews. We see people who are Greek Orthodox. Just all sorts of different religious beliefs. We don't have a lot of Muslim immigration or anything like that at this point. And people are coming more so from Southern or Eastern Europe. So we see countries like what became Hungary or Italy. Looks like my picture is covering up Italian there a little bit. Ireland, Poland, people from Russia, Czechoslovakia, any of those different territories. But pretty much they're also coming from all over the world at this point. In that first wave of immigration, you had a lot of people who were coming from Asian nations, especially as gold was found in 1849 to try to get rich quick. And as racism towards many Chinese and from many just Asian nations kind of grew in America, and there was this feeling that Asians were taking over all the jobs, we're going to see that immigration from China and Japan will be very limited. So we will see, most of the immigration still coming from Europe. It'll pick up a little bit from Africa, from Latin America, from some Asian nations, but more so in, Western Asia rather than Eastern Asia. So India, things like that. And as immigrants come to America, they're of course coming via boat. That was the only way to get there. Yes, planes by 1903. The Wright brothers will have that first flight at Kitty Hawk, but it's going to be expensive. It's not going to be commercial airline traffic, so it's not really possible. People are coming via boat. They'd have to save up for years potentially to buy passage over. It would, depending on where they were coming from, take a month, 2 months, even longer. And for the most part, they would be traveling what's called steerage, the cheapest accommodations. If they're coming across the Atlantic, they're going to be coming into Ellis Island. So they're going to see the Statue of Liberty, which has the famous saying on it of "Give me your hungry, give me your poor, give me your weak, give me your ailing." You know, we'll take whoever you are, whatever you are, we're willing to accept you. You know, that's one of the things that's literally documented and is the saying that is on the Statue of Liberty. And people saw that and they started to cry and they were so excited for their new life. And they would be going to Ellis Island where they would give them their information. They may be quarantined for a while if it turned out they had some kind of disease before they would be allowed passage into New York City. And then they would have to decide if they were going to stay in New York or go to Chicago or LA. And eventually if they're going to travel on into, the further countryside of the states. If they were crossing the Pacific and coming in through California, they would be going to Angel Island. And in terms of, Angel Island, it would be the same kind of process as far as trying to take down their name, their lineage, their family history. There's still records of that people search through Ancestry.com and such. And then yet again, they would be quarantined if they had some kind of, illness. For the most part, we saw limited, as I said, immigration at this point from China, from Japan, but we see a lot more people like from India and from other countries coming in at Angel Island comparatively, whereas Ellis Island tends to be more Europeans, but otherwise it was a very similar experience. So to wrap that up, old immigrants came between 1800 1880. New immigrants came 1890 1910. The differences are basically originally old immigrants, Protestants, okay, from Western Europe, new immigrants, many religious backgrounds from all over the world. What they have in common is they're both looking for, freedom in terms of religion and economic opportunities, especially when you think about the old immigrants like the Irish trying to escape the potato famine, trying to make a new life for themselves in America. Same thing was happening as the Gilded Age was going on. People were looking for a new life. And here's just some pictures so you can kind of see, what I'm talking about here. And you see as the people, would disembark from the boat, they would have to wait in line. You notice they're only carrying like a suitcase or two. As since, they're in steerage, the cheapest accommodations possible on this boat, they don't have a lot of room for their possessions. It's more that you would have to carry. They don't have a lot of money for housing when they get to the US. They may have to share an apartment with someone else. Who knows how much furniture you're going to have or space to put clothes. So people, for the most part, might bring like a photograph, but it's not like they have a million photos. They might bring a couple mementos with them from back home. A child might bring a toy or two, a book, and then, just some clothes, some shoes with them. But that would be pretty much it. And, it would be a very similar experience from what you can see at the top at Ellis Island compared to Angel Island in the bottom pictures. It just depended basically what coast they were coming in. No matter what, though, all of the immigrants, whether they came through Ellis Island or Angel Island, did experience culture shock, feelings of being unsettled, missing their home, missing their family, excited about being in a new country, worried about how long it would take them to learn the language, concerned that they wouldn't find a job. And as soon as they would be getting off these boats, they would often be accosted by basically political, people who would say, oh, you should join the Republican Party. You should join the Democratic Party. Wear this pin, vote Republican, vote Democrat once you become a U.S. citizen and you pass the citizenship test. In the meantime, how about we help you get a job or find a place to live? You just remember to vote when the time comes. And so it was definitely very organized and very pushy. And, people were often, talked into supporting a political party because of kind of the favors that were done for them. Now, was America truly this melting pot where everybody got along and all the cultures were mixed? Perhaps. I mean, in America, people, of course, have learned English over time, even though that is not our national language. It's not like you're required to learn it in our Constitution or in any law. So people can try to say, speak English, this is America. You may say that, but that's not technically the law by any means. So are we a country where everyone is mixed together and there's a blend? Sure, in some cases, because people celebrate the 4th of July and Thanksgiving and eat a variety of foods. But at the same time, there was a thought process that people wanted to hold on to their own traditions, their own way of life. You just see some pictures there. Now, how did life in America go? Life in America was definitely difficult, to say the least. Because people didn't have a lot of money for housing, they often end up living in apartment complexes called tenements, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute, where they would have to share a bathroom with maybe like 4 or 5 other families. So that was awkward. Or they had to use an outhouse in an alley, which wasn't great. In some cases, it was better than what they had at home. In other cases, it was much worse. And some people maybe thought even maybe we made a mistake by coming here. And they really had to decide if they wanted to truly assimilate or not. Remember, assimilate means to make similar. So, do they truly want to blend in, or how much of their old traditions do they want to hang on to? What ended up happening was a lot of people settled in major cities as they first got to America because they didn't have any more money to travel. So, when they would move to Chicago or New York or Los Angeles, they often ended up living in these ethnic neighborhoods. So that's how you would get Chinatown or Little Italy or Ukrainian Village, Polish neighborhoods. People in that community, they felt like it was like they were back home. Even if they didn't know the people and they were strangers, they spoke the same language, they ate similar foods, they could talk about their old way of life. And of course, they were happy, they were proud to be Americans, and they wanted to embrace American culture. But it was going to take time to get used to the traditions, to learn the language, to understand things. So to try to ease kind of that culture shock, they often moved into these ethnic neighborhoods. They also received, especially early on when they lacked money, help from churches and from what we call benevolent societies, basically just charities. Remember Carnegie and Rockefeller, they're all about this gospel of wealth, maybe Carnegie more than Rockefeller, where the Christian thing to do is to, not die with your money, to give back to others. They would give money to these benevolent societies, which would often, help immigrants, orphans, food, supplies, whatever they needed. Now, as I kind of said before, there is kind of this, difficult situation that the immigrants are going through. Are they going to just be able to accept all of America's traditions? Are they going to become part of this melting pot, which is this blend of their native language and culture mixed with all these other cultures and languages which exist in America? Or are they, so they're going to be able to blend, are they going to be able to truly assimilate, or are they going to be wanting to hold on to their own traditions? Are they going to stay forever in their little Italian village or, Chinatown and never really leave? It's kind of a blend of mix of both, for most people. And even if they wanted to go back home, for the most part, they probably weren't going to be able to because they couldn't afford it. Most people, though, got over the culture shock, their homesickness, and then they were really happy to be in America. Now, remember, these are your notes. You don't have to write down every single word. I will post these later here on Google Classroom. So it's up to you how much you want to write. Now, many people are unhappy about how many immigrants have come to America. There is what we call this nativist response. And we've kind of mentioned it before. It's basically just, instead of racism, it's basically you're just being against a certain ethnic group. So you have this idea that they thought they were the true Americans because they'd already lived there, 20, 50, 100 years perhaps, maybe 200 years, and that they were the real Americans. And they didn't want other people coming in because perhaps they smelled differently, they ate different foods, they spoke a different language. Basically, it was fear. It was fear of the unknown. It was fear of something that's different, which is a very silly attitude. They weren't embracing change by any means. But then there was the realistic fear that perhaps these people were taking their jobs. In all reality, during the Gilded Age, there were tons of jobs. There's plenty of work. Unemployment was not a problem. There were so many new inventions coming out. There was a job to be had. Now, a employer may threaten things like, I'm going to hire this new immigrant coming in. I'm going to pay them half as much, and they're going to work just as hard. It is perhaps, that could have happened. Without government regulation and because of laissez-faire capitalism, that was perhaps a fear. Most employers, though, probably were not going to do that. It was probably an empty threat because they would have to train the new employee, perhaps. But that could have been, a fear in some people's minds. And that fear of the unknown and of a potential, adversary coming in, so to speak, and taking over a job was enough to make people have this nativist response. They were angry. They were bitter towards immigrants. They, talked about them. They started to treat them differently. And so that's discrimination. And often they blamed them for different problems. They even perhaps protested against them, attacked them. So violence definitely did occur. Now, I just kind of wanted to show you, here's some, charts, and you can see what I'm kind of talking about as far as our waves of immigration. That basically the old immigrants, like I said, when we're talking about, 1800 to 1880, you can really see this mass exodus of people in purple there from Western Europe coming to the United States. And also people coming from China mostly and from some Eastern Asian countries to the US especially around 1849 when the gold rush happened, to try to get rich quick. But what's going to happen is that in 1882, the US government passes this law called the Chinese Exclusion Act, where they basically say no more Chinese people can come to America. Why? Because so many Chinese people had come with the gold rush. Obviously, they stayed. They didn't have the money to get back. They ended up working on the railroad. Some of them opened up businesses in California. And so people were basically fearful that there would be somehow more Chinese people in America than true Americans, which is a very biased sentiment because, of course, America is a country of immigrants. It was founded by various groups over time. But there was this fear and this sense of bias and worry about, what would happen to their wealth in the future, this worry that somehow they would be outnumbered and this would be the second China. And they let fear take hold, and then they started to say things like Chinese people look different or sound different, very racist kind of statements. And so they got Congress to pass this law limiting immigration from China to basically zilch. Now, of course, between 1880 and 1910, which you can see with the orange arrow, is other immigrants from Eastern Europe and around the globe continue to come to America for jobs, but it's not going to be Asian immigrants. They're going to first cut off immigrants from China and then later from Japan. And you can kind of see in this political cartoon, you've got Uncle Sam here looking pretty tough, pretty strong, pretty typical. And it's got a big proclamation and it's talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And you can see this very biased picture of what a Chinese person looks like and how Uncle Sam is giving him the boot and kicking him out. And yeah, this was kind of the sentiment by most Americans, that they felt like the Chinese should be excluded and should not be allowed to live in America. And the reasons definitely were all about, they're going to steal our jobs, they're going to ruin our economy, they smell different, they sound different, they're never going to be able to assimilate, they're not Christian, and they're going to overpopulate us. So they were all very racist kinds of mentality. And I don't know if you can see in Uncle Sam's hand, he's got a weird bucket which says like magic washer, and I think it says beats everything maybe. So definitely a very biased kind of cartoon here. I mean, even like look at the face in the sun. Very, very biased cartoon here. Now, Japan didn't want to see this mass exodus where, in the United States, we saw people from China being forced out of the United States. They were denied citizenship, so they weren't allowed to become citizens and vote. They weren't allowed any legal protections under the law. And of course, new immigrants were not allowed to come to America from China for many years. It was just a trickle. You had to meet certain qualifications in terms of owning a business or being educated or something of that nature. Japan basically ends up signing a gentleman's agreement limiting immigration as well. And we're talking about a very small percentage, like an extremely low quota. Now, we're going to move into talking a little bit about the second part, and we're going to talk a little bit and to move away from immigration a little bit. And we're going to talk about just what was city life like during this time period for immigrants, but really for all Americans. And you've got some images here. And of course, as all these immigrants are coming to America, they're moving to the cities for the most part because they don't have the money to move into the country, and most of the jobs were in the cities. And so the cities are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And as the cities are growing, steel is, of course, the main, item that's going to be used to build these skyscrapers. And the thought was, why not build upward rather than building outward into valuable farmland? Build upward, okay? And that way people can still be close to their job, especially since most people, did not have a car and they were relying on public transit. And then, of course, steel was also going to be used during this time for railroads and for bridges, for heavy machinery, you name it. And, of course, many people were employed working for various steel factories. But as I was saying before, immigration kind of, occurs because there's new jobs. Well, there's new jobs, which leads to immigration, which leads to people moving to cities, which leads to city problems. So we're going to talk here just a little bit about what was city life like in terms of some of the positive changes and more of the pop culture stuff about the Gilded Life and the Gilded Age. But then we're also going to talk about some of the problems that are created because of cities being overcrowded. And this in general, like I said, this just comes from chapter 6. And some of these are just statistics. You're not going to have to know, the first point on here by any means. I've just got some statistics. So feel free, as I said, if you don't want to write all this stuff down, you don't have to by any means. So basically, just to kind of get this, into your head, most people in America, all the immigrants, are living in the cities and they are extremely poor. I think I was telling you this before that their average annual income, meaning each year, they only make about $380. So they're only making a little over $1 a day for the most part. It's well below poverty line. Some people made $1.20 a day. So yeah, it was not great. We might see some people, if they were skilled or if they had been more experienced, maybe making $2 a day. But since these wages were so low, as people got married and had families, that's why women who were poor often had to work, and then children, of course, had to work as well. If it was possible that they were in the middle class, maybe they would make $700, $800, $1,000 a year, but it's still extremely low, especially compared to people like John D. Rockefeller with 1.4 billion. But when you look at that number, 11 million out of the nation's 12 million families earned less than 1,200 per year. That really, I think, kind of sums it up for you and puts it into perspective that most families, you know, are not wealthy by any means. They're even barely middle class, especially compared to the other million people who are extremely wealthy. So during this time period, as they're coming out with all these new products like the telephone, the typewriter, the light bulb and electricity and skyscrapers that come out with phonographs, you still have to remember that even though these people produce these items in factories, for the most part, they own none of them. There's no credit cards back then. They can barely have enough money for food, for rent. They had to save for their retirement. There was no Social Security. And so they can't afford to buy these products. There's no credit card. There's no kind of lifeline. And so it's either you make it or you don't. So most people are definitely not going to be buying these goods. It was definitely a difficult time period to be living in. Now, if people did save up their money, what we're going to see happen, especially as we get into 1890, 1900, into 1910, we're going to start to see the very beginning of pictures, okay, literally like people having a camera. George Eastman comes out with the Kodak camera, and this will be the beginning of really photojournalism, where people want to tell a story, and instead of sketching the picture like they used to in the newspaper, now they're actually going to be taking photographs. We'll have photographers who are trying to not just take a wedding picture of someone, and they also took pictures at funerals, which was really creepy. But people will be taking more pictures of their lives to, show their pastimes and their interests and their family. And eventually, as we get into 1890, 1900, 1910, you'll see the first movies come out. There'll be silent moving pictures, very different than what we're used to today. If people did have any fun, it's really going to be on Sunday. Sunday they would get up early. Most Americans were religious. They'd go to church. It was a day of rest. It's their only day off. Maybe they do some chores with their family. But if they're living in the city, in apartments, it's not like they have grass to mow. It's not like they live on a farm where they have animals to feed. So if they had saved up any money, they would perhaps take a bicycle ride. Some more of the wealthy people would play tennis. As baseball was starting to become more popular, it really becomes the national pastime by the 1920s. We get football at that time as well. They might go watch a game. If they, had some kind of education and were able to read and write, they might go buy a magazine or a book. Now, all Americans, for the most part, could read a little bit. They kind of at least had some education, some schooling, and people bought the newspaper constantly because that's how you would be getting your news. It would be extra, extra, read all about it. A boy or a girl would stand on the corner and yell the top stories to encourage people to buy the paper. And of course, as we move into the 20th century, the radio will become their big news source. But at least for now, it's still the newspaper. And, eventually we're going to see the creation of amusement parks. So escalators are coming out during this time period, elevators. Eventually we see roller coasters and the Ferris wheel. So all sorts of new inventions, early forms of refrigerators. We're starting to get on the right path, but people just don't have the money for the products. But I think times are definitely changing, and amusement parks would be more so like the World's Fair, kind of educational, kind of entertainment. People would save up their money, and this would be their big source of entertainment. And of course, if they live close to a beach and such, they would still do those kinds of things, take walks. Now, we also see that shopping is starting to change, especially as we get into the 1890s and into the early 1900s. We're going to see the creation of the department store. Prior to this time, if people were going to go shopping on a Saturday or Sunday, for the most part, they would be going to the butcher to get meat, and to a grocer, to perhaps get the rest of their groceries, go to a baker to get bread. They would go to a woman's shop to perhaps buy a woman gloves, because women never had gloves off. It was always very proper to have your hands covered. In a way, it was kind of a natural protection from germs. It also covered up your hands from any kind of sores, lesions, anything like that. It was, always considered appropriate for women to have covered up hands. It showed if they were rough from working. So it was just kind of the trend for many, many years in history. So they would go to, a women's store for women's clothes, and there'd be a men's store, there'd be a home goods store. You're getting the point. So eventually Marshall Field was one of the first to come out with a department store. So they'd be like Kohl's, or Walmart or JCPenney, a store that you could buy clothes for a man, a woman, housewares, kitchen stuff. And obviously that's evolved, into the late 20th century to a superstore Walmart that also includes food. We also see Woolworth was one of the first stores to be a dime store. Of course, today we have dollar stores like Dollar Tree, Dollar General. And Montgomery Ward and Sears were some of the first companies to offer basically buying via catalog. And, you would mail catalogs to people. They would buy goods, they'd buy clothes, things for their homes. It was the idea that you'd be getting flyers from stores and advertisements in the mail, and people would then get the goods shipped to them. So even people living out west could now potentially get the new product. So things are starting to definitely change and moving into more of a modern direction. Now that we've kind of talked about what city life was like in general, let's talk about some of those problems with city life. Everybody moved to the city at the same time. And the first real problem was, where do people live? For the most part, as I said before, instead of moving out into the country and away from the city center, because that would take up valuable farmland and people didn't have any transportation, they wanted to be close to the city. So architects build up and they build these skyscrapers of sorts for, businessmen. And for the average American, they build tenement apartments, which you can see the different floors there. And here's kind of the apartment layout. You can see it. And in one apartment, what you're looking at in that picture that's 4 apartments, okay? So you've got a parlor, okay? So that's kind of like your very formal kind of front room where you would like have visitors. Then you have your living room. So that's like your family room of your house today where you probably like sit. Your living room would also usually would have like a dining room and a kitchen. Because that doesn't exist kind of in this this diagram, I'm assuming that their parlor is where they would like greet people, and their living room of sorts would probably have a hot plate, and they would kind of cook on it and have it somewhat of a makeshift kitchen. And that's where they would perhaps also relax and have a table. And the formal, more living room area would be the parlor where they would read. And then they've got 2 bedrooms. And then if you look into that public hall, the WC, that's the water closet. So that's the toilet, that's the bathroom. And of course, it'd be a bathtub, no shower. And that, plan is laid out floor after floor. So you're sharing, 2 bathrooms with 4 apartments, and there might be multiple people living in those apartments. Sometimes we even saw 2 families live in one apartment. And so, of course, we saw mice, we saw rats, we saw problems with, dirt and lack of sanitation. Germs spread easily. There was a real problem at this point. And of course, the cities just continue to grow and grow because, of course, new immigrants are coming to America, right, to work at all these factories which are being opened and for all these new inventions which are being made. And, as we said, people aren't happy with being cowboys, with being ranchers. They don't like farming in the Great Plains. It's very difficult, right, doing dry farming. They might move back to the cities. And, farm machines are basically taking over their jobs anyway. So they move to the cities to get factory jobs. And then, of course, we said, African Americans are trying to escape racism in the South, escape some of those Jim Crow laws which exist that are segregate the races. So they might be coming north as well, for a new life. So the cities just continue to grow and grow and grow. And you can see how overcrowded it is at this point. Here's some more pictures. You can see of city kids, how they were dressed. And look at those kids' outfits. I mean, they're pretty dressed up. So naturally, there's a lot of different problems that exist in the city. For the most part, one of them, as you saw, was the tenements. People didn't have a lot of money. They're living in very cramped quarters. They even have to share a bathroom, kind of embarrassing, kind of awkward. They might even have to share the apartment with another family. There weren't a lot of high standards. The buildings were often made out of wood. They were very drafty, plus, as I said, there were rats and things, and, lack of real sanitation and hygiene, and germs just spread. It was almost like college-style dorm living, and not very comfortable. And then the other problem was, these cities were created years and years before, so they had no real transportation system or network. Now that they're evolving, they're going to try to have to make up for the needs of all these extra people. So in Chicago, they created the elevated train to try to move people around. In New York City, they create the subway to try to move people around. In San Francisco, they have streetcars. The other problem is, how do you produce clean water? Running water is first going to be created. Otherwise, people are still getting water from a well. It's difficult to transport, so they're going to be trying to build this massive piping system to get people clean water into their homes. Just some more pictures there. A couple of other problems here would be that when you deal with all this waste and garbage, it's not like today where we figured out recycling and water treatment plants and landfills. All of that was a challenge. And one of the other big problems, as I said, was the buildings were for the most part made out of wood, and they were very cheaply designed. And so fires were extremely common, especially since cities didn't have enough fire departments. They weren't located in a center location. And so we saw in the Great Chicago Fire, which the infamous story says that Mrs. O'Leary's cow knocked over the lantern, which is all myth. We know that in reality it had been very dry in Chicago. There was a drought. We're not sure exactly who lit the fire, but because the buildings were too close together, made out of wood, and there was a drought, it just went up. And before you know it, within a matter of 2-3 days' time, the fire kept burning. 100,000 people ended up being homeless. Many people died, and it was $200 million in damage. And the city basically had to be rebuilt from scratch, turning it into more of a modern city. You've also, during this time period, you've got the San Francisco earthquake. And really, this was going to be an eye-opening experience as well, because it made them realize, if we're going to be dealing with earthquakes, we need to redesign our buildings and our city differently. Of course, as more people move to the cities, there's also an issue with crime. So we're going to be needing to build more police departments to try to stop some of this crime. A lot of theft was going on. And as more and more immigrants moved to America and moved to the cities, and just people were moving to the cities in general, we had homeless people on the streets, there was begging, and so more organizations were being built to try to help this gap between the rich and the poor, and really to kind of assist the poor and to get them off the streets. In particular, there's this social gospel movement, which is the idea that the Christian thing to do is to fix society's social problems, be moral, be ethical, help the poor, give them what they need, whether it's food, shelter, supplies. Very similar to Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth in a sense. And Jane Addams is a supporter of the social gospel movement. She supported women's rights. She was a suffragette trying to give women the right to vote. She helped create this organization called the Settlement House, where she was going to help immigrants learn English, learn a skill like women could learn typewriting, provide babysitting activities, daycare, you name it, give people a place to stay, a job, just whatever they really needed. And one of her most famous settlement houses is Hull House in Chicago, and she really helped a lot of people find their footing. All right, so that's it for now, guys. Have a great day. Complete that exit slip. Later.